Good evening, everybody, as we are beginning the week of Parashat Miketz and continuing with Rav Bazak. The first first comment, which we're not going to look at, um, is Rav Bazak's suggestion that he asked a good question, which is in what was so difficult about interpreting the dreams, and what was Yosef's unique innovation? And he suggests that it had to do with understanding the significance of the numbers in the dreams. Short little comment worth a look. We're going to start with the second one, which I'll share my screen. We can look at together. It happened to be that the question that Rabazak asks here is one of the one question we were discussing in our Saturday night parent-child learning, looking ahead to this week's Parashah, so it particularly caught my eye. And he asks, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same, question mark? At first glance, Pharaoh's dreams seem identical. The only difference is that one features sheaves and the other cows, in reverse order. However, as Paro recounts his dreams, a major difference emerges. In the case of the dream with the cows, the skinny cows swallow the fat cows but are not changed at all. He says that when they had consumed them, one could not tell that they had consumed them, for they looked just as bad as before. In the case of the sheaves, that detail is missing. And Ezra Bazak points out here, that difference emerges only in Paro's recounting his dreams. So if we look briefly at the Parashah, it begins with the narrator describing the dreams. And there, first we're told that the Parot Haraot ate up the Parot Yefot HaMareh, with no discussion about how their appearance was or wasn't impacted. And then the thin ears swallowed up the seven solid and full ears, and that's it. Then, when Paro recounts his dreams to Yosef, he says that the seven sturdy cows emerged and the seven ill-formed cows came up after them. And then we get this pasuk. After they had consumed them, lo nodaki ba'u el kilbana, you couldn't even tell. Marehen ra kasher batchila, they look just as bad as before. This is a new detail of the dream. And yet, when Paro recounts the second dream, he simply recounts it with the seven healthy ears of grain, and then the seven shriveled ones, and the thin ones swallowing the healthy, and that's it. No mention of how they were or weren't changed. Is this an objective difference, or does it reflect Paro's subjective response? The Torah's description of the dreams contains some hint of what Paro says. The Torah describes the cows as ugly and gaunt as they came up out of the river, and they are described that way even after they have swallowed the fat cows. And the ugly, gaunt cows ate up the seven handsome, sturdy cows. In the second dream about the sheaves, the first sheaves are described as thin and scorched by the east wind. However, after they're swallowed up, that description is shortened to the thin ears swallowed up the seven solid and full ears. How can we explain this difference? So, in other words, when Paro recounts his dreams, he mentions that there's no indication of any change in the cows when the thin swallow when the all right, when the thin cows swallowed the fat cows. And he doesn't mention anything about that when it comes to the sheaves. But now Rabazak goes back and looks and says maybe there's a little hint to actually that discrepancy in that when the Torah describes the cows before swallowing and then upon or after swallowing, they have their same description. But when the narration of the dream describes the sheaves before and after, the description does change a little bit. So maybe there is already a hint to Paro's differentiation in the way the Torah tells it, but it's a very, very subtle hint if it is anything at all. In the first dream, the skinny cows are not improved by eating the fat cows. Now, Rabbi Zak seems to sort of essentially at this point be saying, It's true in Paro's retelling, and the Torah gives a hint to it. So let's actually take it as descriptive of a real difference between the dreams. And when it comes to the cows, there's no change after the swallowing. Yosef echoes this in his interpretation. And now we're at the third level. We have the narration of the dream, Paro's retelling of the dream, and now Yosef's interpretation of the dream. And Yosef echoes this in his interpretation. All the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. This is his interpretation of the first dream. As the land is ravaged by famine, no trace of the abundance will be left in the land because of the famine thereafter, for it will be very severe. Right? So the famine swallowing up the plenty will be so significant that the plenty will leave no trace, and the famine will be that severe. Afterward, Yosef describes a different scenario, which more closely matches the dream of the sheaves. He says, let the grain be collected under Paro's authority as food to be stored in the cities. Let that food be a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which will come upon the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish in the famine. Sorry, when I said this explanation in verse 41 was not explicitly a interpretation of the first dream, because Yosef doesn't really differentiate between the two dreams. He says Paro's two dreams are one, but yet he sort of talks about the reality in two different ways. The idea that no trace of the abundance will be left, and then the idea that if food is gathered as a reserve, then somehow the experience of the years of famine will not be as severe. And this is where Abazak gets to, I think, his novel insight. This seems to be the explanation for the two similar but not identical dreams. The dreams establish that a serious famine will arrive in 7 years. Then, having had the same dream twice, it means that the matter has been determined by God. God is, the doubling here, Yosef says, is that God is intent upon making this happen. However, Paro did not dream the same dream twice. He had two separate dreams. They represent two possible futures, depending on which course of action Paro chooses. One model is that of the cows. Following that will lead to a situation in which no trace of the abundance will be left. That is what will happen to most of the world. But there is a second possibility. That is the model of the sheaves. Here, the effect of the famine will be blunted, because the Egyptians will draw upon the food they stored up in the years of plenty, so that the land may not perish in the famine. Both options lie before Paro. He only has to choose. Let's just look at that briefly here at the end. Yosef says, right, they're 7 years ahead of abundance, and then the famine will come and all the abundance will be forgotten. This is kind of variation number one, the cow version. And then when he gives his guidance, Rabbi Zak is sort of interpreting that as the alternative way of experiencing the famine, which is gathering in the plenty, and therefore it will be a reserve, so that the land may not perish during the years of the famine. And so I think it's a really fascinating take. Again, these things, this sort of gets to a question about how we interpret, small details and slight discrepancies in the Torah. You have a kind of a minimalist interpretation that says, okay, they're just like little variations. Paro, said it, the narrator said it one way, Paro said it a slightly different way. Maybe with cows, it's more noticeable, if when they swallow something up, they look different or don't look different. So that stood out to Paro. Whereas with the sheaves don't normally swallow anything. So it wasn't something Paro would have commented on. We could certainly make a plain sense argument for why Paro might have narrated the two differently, and that Yosef is interpreting the dreams and offering a plan of action. But given the two dreams back to back, I think that Rabbi Zak makes a really interesting suggestion that actually, Yosef is noticing that slight discrepancy, and the Torah even hints at it in the narrator's version of the dream. It's there to kind of suggest to us that there are two directions this could go. If kind of left unaddressed, then indeed the famine will, overtake all the plenty and leave no trace. But if with the right kind of planning, a slightly different, an importantly different version can emerge in which there is a, a storage which leaves its mark during the famine and allows for survival during the famine, even though it's still a famine, but there's an opportunity to survive and be sustained during it. Thoughts, reactions to this? Again, I haven't seen anyone else suggest this, um, although I've seen the question about this slight discrepancy, but nothing quite as significant a reading and interpretation as this one. Thoughts or reactions to it? Okay,
I like Rev Stephen Exler's. I like Rev Stephen Exler's description better.
Okay, fair, fair. Yeah, yeah.
The grain is an input in society that where the famine is evidence, and the cows, living beings, represent the society. I like the way you described it much better.
Okay, thank you. Good. So as always, the question is good, and it hopefully generates our own different thinking about possible answers. This is a new one to add into the hopper. Okay, let's go on to I'm just going to skip over number 3 and come to number 4. Okay, the fourth comment of Rav Bazak. Here too, noticing something small in the text, which I never really thought about before, and offering an interesting literary reading. Okay, it's called They Did Accordingly. This parsha contains one of the most troubling exegetical issues in all of the Torah. This is a very bold claim, which I was not convinced by, and we'll see how we do with it. One of the most troubling exegetical issues in all of the Torah. After Yosef put his brothers in jail, we read in chapter 42. On the third day, Yosef said to them, "Do this, and you shall live. Let one of your brothers be held in your place of detention, while the rest of you go and take home rations for your starving households. But you must bring me your younger brother, that your words may be verified, and that you may not die." And they did accordingly. See the Hebrew. Hey, first when they come and they ask, Yosef accuses them of being spies, and they say, "No, we're all sons of the same man. We're honest. We've never been spies. The youngest is not with us." And Yosef says, "See, this is just as I told you. You're spies. I'm not going to let you out unless your youngest brother comes," and and confines them all. And then he says, "Okay, here's the plan. I'll hold on to just one of you. The rest of you go home and take rations, but you have to bring me your youngest brother." Vayasuchein, and they did accordingly. That's in bold. What did they do accordingly? Did they go home and bring Binyamin? They did not. Immediately after Yosef's words, we read that the brothers said to one another, "Alas, we are being punished on account of our brother." Only afterward do we get a long description of the brothers' return home and of their bringing Binyamin. How are we to understand what the brothers did? Right? So what does it actually mean? Usually right after someone gives instructions and it says Vayasu Chen, then you understand that they did exactly that thing right then and there, and the narrative should then continue, after the completion of the previously described action having been carried out. Right? And Rabbi Zak says, surprisingly, the only one of the classical commentators to deal with this strange phrase is Chizkuni. He understands it to mean that they said that they would do it. When it says Vayasu Chen, they did accordingly, it means, they said, okay, we will do accordingly. Okay? His position here is difficult because whenever this phrase appears, it means that someone took action. So Chizkuni offers an answer. It's not a strong answer because it involves interpreting this phrase differently than it's usually interpreted. Of course, the motivation to do that is that as Rav Bazak has pointed out, it's hard to read it literally. So you offer a variant reading of how it appears, and that's just difficult because that's not how it's usually used. Let us point out. So we got the question. It's an uncommon, exceptional use of vayasu chen, and they did accordingly. Let us point out that from here onward, the brothers' remorse over selling Yosef becomes a dominant theme of the narrative. This is most obvious when they say they are being punished for their sin, and Yosef cries right after um, and they did accordingly. We hear them say to one another, "We're being punished on account of our brother, because we saw his anguish, yet paid no heed as he pleaded with us." Which is an interesting comment by the brothers, because the text itself has not told us that. In last week's parsha, when it recounts, it says they threw him into a pit and they went down and sat and had a meal. And some other merchants came and took Yosef out of the pit and sold him. And and so the idea that he was crying out to them and they weren't listening at some point has not been narrated by the Torah, but okay, we can take them at their word. That is a new narrative detail that emerges, which is something they feel very guilty about now, and understand that that's why this distress has come upon them. And Ruvain said, didn't I tell you not to do anything to him? You didn't listen, and now, here we go. The text goes on to say they didn't know Yosef understood because there was an interpreter between him and them, but of course he understood them speaking in whatever Semitic language that they all grew up speaking together they were saying. They were speaking to each other. Vayisov me'alehem vayef. He turned away from them and wept. Then he still circles back and imprisons Shimon and sends them all back to come back with Binyamin. But he hears their remorse and he's moved by it, at least for the moment. So again, let us point out that from here onward, the brothers' remorse over selling Yosef becomes a dominant theme of the narrative. This is most obvious in the psukim we just looked at, when they say they are being punished for their sin and Yosef cries. However, even later, when Yaakov refuses to send Binyamin, the way the brothers step up to assume responsibility for their youngest brother, first Ruvain, who says, you can kill my sons if I don't return him, and then Yehuda, who says, I'll take responsibility for him, shows a kind of atonement for their earlier actions. So the kind of consequences of the sale and their behavior in it and their attempt to behave differently certainly underlies the continuation of the story alongside the kind of plot developments. This section of the narrative is intended to show the brothers' active repentance. Right here, Bazak is just sort of answering, I think, a question, why do we have so much close narrative and such extensive detailing of the stories of going back and forth? And he's suggesting the kind of overall purpose of the narration and detail of this section is to show the brothers' active repentance. In light of this, perhaps we can reach an understanding of "and they did accordingly." Perhaps the expression is meant to summarize their entire journey. The continuation of this phrase is to be found in the next parak, when the brothers stand together with Binyamin before Yosef. It is as if the Torah has set out two different scripts. Okay, let's just understand what he means here. So what he's suggesting is, right after it says Vayasu Chain, right? Yosef tells them, go, I'm going to hold on to one of your brothers. You all go home and come down with with the youngest brother. And it says Vayasu Chain. They did accordingly. What Rav Bazak is actually saying is this version of the story, Vayasu Chain, actually means they did it all. And now we actually skip all the way to skipping all the way to essentially here when Yosef sees Binyamin, the middle of the next chapter, when they actually arrive back with Binyamin. That's kind of like, version one of the way of telling the story. Vayasu Chain, they did it. We don't need any of the details of the rest of this, and we could pick up right there. That's one version. It is as if the Torah has set out two different scripts. In the first short version, the brothers go back and bring Binyamin down to Egypt. That happens in that single phrase, Vayasu Chain, they did it. There's no mention of their feelings of remorse or their commitment to watch out for their youngest brother. In this scenario, the brothers do not yet understand the meaning of what is happening to them. There is no regret and no owning up to their past. But together with this story is another one in which the brothers do acknowledge their earlier failings. Right, so this sort of second parallel account is the one that actually takes the whole rest of chapter 42 and the beginning of 43, which is the same story but told with a focus on their awareness of their wrongdoing and their attempts to repair their mistakes in the journey. Why does the Torah give us two different scenarios? Perhaps to explain the ambivalence of the brothers. On the one hand, they are inclined to hurry and to bring back Binyamin as Yosef has ordered. Vayasu chein, they did it. We don't need to dwell on the details. On the other hand, a certain sense of remorse and self-awareness has been awakened. In offering two narratives, the Torah expresses the two different emotional responses evoked by events in Egypt. Eventually, with the incident of the goblet and Yehuda stepping up to do the right thing, the process of repentance will be completed. So this is an interesting kind of idea, um, you know, unusual. Sometimes we have in the Torah kind of an interlude to tell a different story. Like last week's Parsha, we were told that Yosef was brought down to Egypt. Then we have the pause and we have the Yehuda and Tamar story, and then we pick up again with Yosef Hurad Mitzrayma. He was brought down to Egypt, and we resume from there. This is sort of saying a kind of a different type of literary approach. Not that you repeat in order to pick up where you left off, but you sort of condense in a short summary and then tell another longer version of the story kind of in parallel. And you obviously can't do them side by side, so you do them one after another, short version and then long version, to kind of highlight the two different modes or tones that are kind of competing in the way the story is being told. So, Rabbi Zak doesn't say, he doesn't tell us, and this is just like the other two or three times where this thing happens in the Chumash. So I don't know whether there are other examples that he's thinking about, that he sees this as a literary tool that can be used. Again, it's in a sense, when we compare it to the Chizkuni, who's had to read the phrase Vayasu Chen, and they did accordingly, not literally, but rather they said they would do accordingly. Indeed, Rab Bazak's reading has the strength of being able to preserve the literal reading of the words Vayasu Chen in accordance with all the other times it appears as describing actually carrying out the action. But it does require now this sort of strange splicing approach, which is which is harder. I see James wrote in documentary hypothesis. It's a good question. I don't know whether any of the biblical critics suggest that these are really two different versions, the short version and the long version, that are kind of being preserved side by side. It certainly seems like, it hints in that direction. Um, and I also wonder when he says, whether he's hinting to that when he says, the only one of the classical commentators to deal with this strange phrase. Maybe he's aware of the fact that the modern commentators deal with it in a different way. Maybe it's a tiny hint to critical scholarship. I don't know. I'm curious about that as well. So yeah, that's another possible direction to go. However, you kind of whatever theology you place underneath that approach certainly is another possible way to go. Okay, yes, comments from Lance and then Bracha, please.
Here are two sentences. Rav Stephen takes out the Torah. The Torah is taken out by Rav Stephen. What's the difference? What do we call that?
Active voice and passive voice.
Exactly. And how does Noam Chomsky in his transformational grammar look at it?
Now you've stumped me.
There's a deep structure.
Okay.
That underlines both. You might say the deep structure is the Torah is read. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that there are deep structures here. For example, the two dreams, Joseph interprets those dreams with basically with one interpretation. And that would be a deep structure to the dreams. And Joseph says that there's one dream. And I think that Pharaoh also talks about a dream, if I remember the text correctly. All right. Yeah. The other thing I like to do is compare this story, the story of Joseph and the return of the brothers, with the story of Jacob wrestles with the angel. Jacob wrestling with the angel is about what? 3 verses, 4 verses. This
Hmm.
is huge.
Yeah, it's huge.
This story is a huge story. Now, the documentary hypothesis implies that there's more than one author here. And I would even go farther and say that there are bazillion little pieces floating around that have been stitched together by what do you call it? The Talmud god, a stam?
Yes, the stam. Yes.
Right. So there's a stam here that we just don't know about. And it seems to me that, what you're suggesting in terms of little stories, big stories, you think about the plagues of the Pharaoh in Genesis. I think that was almost like one line. And the plagues of the Pharaoh in Exodus is huge,
Right.
but it's the same plagues. I mean, same idea. God plagues the Egyptians, right? That's the deep structure
Right.
in
Right.
both. And you also have, for example, in the Haftorah of Devorah, there are really two Haftorahs there. One is basically prose and the other is poetry.
Yeah.
But the supposedly the poetry comes first. I think that scholars would suggest, but
Hmm.
it's the same basic um, text, but it's got different structure.
Great. Thank you. Deep structure.
Deep structure.
Bracha, please.
Yeah, I'm wondering the the stories in the dreams, like the story about the cows, whether that's meant to mirror the brothers.
Say more.
In terms of that maybe they should have been impacted by what they did, but they weren't. You know,
Mm.
in terms of just swallowing up um, the positives that they were able to grab hold of in getting rid of Yosef, but not realizing the consequences that they needed to deal with.
Interesting. Why would Paro dream those dreams about, right, about the brothers of a guy in jail who he'd never met? A thought, Bracha? I love the symbolic reading. I'm just curious about, you know, placing those lessons for the brothers in the mind or, experience of Paro, who's a total stranger to them.
Well, because they were the ones that caused him to end up in Egypt and in this the whole complex web of that experience.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean that Paro knew that, but he was almost being used as a messenger.
Mm-hmm. 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 Right. In the master plan theory, there could be, I mean, right, it could even be both. It could be that Paro had dreams that had to do with, his economic preoccupations, about the welfare of Egypt, and Yosef, interprets them in relation to that, but somehow we as readers, you know, are also attuned to a message for Yosef to carry a certain awareness about his brothers and their experiences. Yeah, it's totally, it certainly is a nice additional layer of interpretation. Great, great. Okay, let's go to one more. Recreating Yosef's journey to Egypt. This had just special interest to me because it's a connection between this parsha and the previous, which is my bar mitzvah parsha by Yeshev. So, and it's relating also back to what Lance was saying. I find the narrative in Miketz, and I don't know if this would be different if it were my bar mitzvah parsha. I find the narrative in Miketz just harder to hold on to. There's so many dimensions of repetition, the repetition of the dream, and then the repetition of the visits down, and the repetition of the, money in the sacks, with slight variations, and the multiple visits to Yosef, the multiple occasions of crying when he hears different things. It feels it's obviously not repetitive. There are these subtle developments, as we were trying to point out in some instances, but I think the dynamism of the plot in Vayeshev has so much more movement and energy to it. I find the Miketz kind of following the Miketz story and retaining it more challenging. Okay, so after Yaakov is convinced to send Binyamin down to Egypt, he orders his sons to take some of the choice products of the land in your baggage and carry them down as a gift for the man, some balm and some honey, gum, ladanum, pistachio nuts, and almonds. We'll see that here. קחו מזמרת הארץ בכליכם והורידו לאיש מנחה, מעט צורי ומעט דבש, נחות ועלות, botnim, ushkedim. This unusual list is reminiscent of the produce carried by the Ishmaelites who bought Yosef and took him down to Egypt. ויסעו עיניהם ויראו, והנה אורחת ישמעאלים באה מגלעד, וכמעליהם נושאים נחות וצרי ועלות. הולכים להוריד מצרימה, הולכים להוריד מצרימה. They're looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites from Gilad, their camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum, the same three as the honey, gum, and ladanum here to be taken to Egypt. What's the significance of this similarity? It seems that the brothers who with the caravan of Ishmaelites, the goods they were carrying when they sold Yosef down to Egypt, the same three items are amongst the three things are amongst the things. Those same three items are amongst the things that Yaakov instructs the brothers to take with them when they now go down to Egypt to Yosef, taking Binyamin with them. It seems that the brothers were divinely ordained. Okay, that's a significant description. Divinely ordained, meaning Yaakov wasn't aware. It couldn't have been a conscious intention of Yaakov's because he wasn't aware of what would have been in the Ishmaelite caravan taking Yosef to Egypt because he didn't know anything about any of that. Divinely ordained to bring Binyamin down to Egypt in the same fashion that Yosef went. The brothers saw the Ishmaelite caravans and thought of selling Yosef. The fact that Yosef was sold for 20 pieces of silver indicates that the Ishmaelites were traveling with a great deal of money. The brothers, too, travel with silver and take with you double the money, carrying back with you the money that was replaced in the mouths of your bags. This is the next verse after the description of the special goods to bring. Perhaps it was a mistake. Traveling down to Egypt laden with silver and fragrant spices would have reminded the brothers of Yosef and his journey into Egyptian slavery. Now, this is, I think, a little bit of a question because we have to go back and read in Vayeshev. They throw Yosef into the pit, and the pit was empty. They sit down to a meal. Looking up, they saw the caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilad with their camels bearing gum, balm, etc., to be taken to Egypt. They say, what do we gain? Let's sell them to the Ishmaelites. They agree. Then we don't know what happens. And then it says that Midianite traders pass by and they pull Yosef out of the pit. And it says they sold Yosef for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites. That seems like that might have been the Midianite traders. This is a whole complicated section in and of itself with confusing pronouns. And so it's not clear that the brothers actually sold Yosef in this moment. It might have been the Midianites, but we do know that they saw the caravan of Ishmaelites. Unclear if they saw close enough to know what they were bearing with them to be taken to Egypt. So when Rab Bazak says, they saw the Ishmaelite caravans and thought of selling Yosef, or says a little bit further, traveling to Egypt laden with silver and fragrant spices would have reminded the brothers of Yosef and his journey into Egyptian slavery. It's not clear that we can say that quite so sharply. It certainly reminds the readers of Yosef and his journey into Egyptian slavery. But Rav Bazak wants to assume that it was the brothers who pulled him out and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and therefore they would, having sold him then, would also have seen, and been aware of what else they were carrying. So we know that that was his reading, and therefore he does understand this to be a reminder for them of Yosef and his journey. This also explains their fear at being brought into his house. But the men were frightened at being brought into Yosef's house. It must be, they thought, because of the money replaced in our bags the first time that we have been brought inside, as a pretext to attack us and seize us as slaves with our pack animals, right? So they are conscious as they're going down of the fact that somehow they're on a similar journey to the one that Yosef went on when they sold him, and therefore they're feeling vulnerable, paranoid, something like that. The parallels between Yosef and Binyamin's journeys to Egypt also highlight the repentance of the brothers. Where Yosef was brought down with a caravan of merchants, Binyamin was brought with his brothers, who had guaranteed his safety. The feeling of unity among the brothers was not something to be taken for granted, as Binyamin was, like Yosef, a son of the favored wife Rachel. Right, as we said in the beginning of last week's Parsha, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. Yaakov related to Binyamin as special, as Yosef was. He calls him, and only him, my son. My son must not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. Okay, so we have certain similarities, not as extreme as the tunic and things like that, but the being the other child of the favored Rachel, and these little ways of relating, and the fact that actually, as Rabbi Silber pointed out on Shabbat between Mincha and Marav, the fact that Yaakov is actually willing, for a time being, the fact that he does not agree to send Binyamin right away is the greatest favoritism, because in a sense, he's saying to the brothers, I'm willing to sacrifice all of our food and kind of capacity to more hastily be nourished at the, I'm willing to sacrifice all of that just to protect Binyamin, meaning make all of you, okay, Binyamin included, but still make all of you hungry to protect Binyamin's life. So that Rabbi Bazak doesn't relate to that, but that in a certain sense is the greatest example of the continued favoritism. And along with that, the special way of referring to him and the, favored mother. So the brothers still see all of that. They're still experiencing that sense of favoritism. Despite this, the brothers made up for their harshness to Yosef by being kind to Binyamin. They did not wish to cause their father harm by hurting his beloved child. They were willing to be taken captive rather than have their father lose another son. When they went to Egypt with Binyamin, some of the particulars were the same as when Yosef went, but there was one important difference. Binyamin would not be abandoned. So this is, again, a fairly classic Rav Bazak, setting up the parallel, pointing out what it highlights in terms of the awareness of the reader and the awareness of the brothers going through the narrative experience in real time, and then also highlighting the differences and what that shows us about the, character development, so to speak, and teshuvah process of the brothers. Thoughts on this one? Lance, you unmuted?
Yes.
Great. And then we'll
Okay,
go back.
one of the things that I consider here is the literary concept of the upward arc. And if you look at the upward arc, you see, particularly with the story of Joseph, it starts out in the pit. And along the way, Joseph puts his brothers in jail, which is a pit. And but the fundamental structure here is an upward arc from the Garden of Eden to Egypt. And you have to get to the land of Goshen. No matter what happens, you got to get to the land of Goshen, because in the land of Goshen, you have the Hebrews developing into a giant community that's going to be enslaved. And now in the book of Exodus, you start with the enslaved Hebrews, and the upward arc takes you to Joshua and the promised land.
Hmm.
I'm sure we can think of other upward arcs in Tanakh, but it seems to me that this is sort of like a fundamental plot line. And yes, there are bazillion contradictions and nuances and all sorts of things that everybody I mean, I don't know what's done in the yeshiva, but certainly in Torah.com, they argue about these things all the time. And we've been doing it here, and I don't think that anything that's been said here is really wrong. Okay, including the symbolism, all that stuff. It's right, it's good, it's valid. But the problem is that it's all human interpretation.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the divine authority is this upward arc. And I hate to bring this up, but you could argue that from October 7th to Assad's elimination is an upward arc. And that the Israelis in the last several weeks, even going back, I think starting with the pagers, have done some miraculous things. And that the whole Middle East now is totally changed from what it was on October 8th. That's what I'm arguing. But I'm seeing arcs.
Yes.
Seeing upward arcs.
It's a nice connection also to our Thursday morning class in Yirmiyahu, because the upward arc is out of Egypt, and so watching the Jewish people after the fall of Judea and the destruction of the first Commonwealth and of the first temple actually go back to Egypt, I think following that approach of the arc, when you not just veer off the arc path, but literally slide right back down, it's certainly all the more jarring. So I think that that kind of way of looking at the, even if there are steps back and deviations, kind of the overall trajectory is a nice sort of rubric. So thank you. Other comments, David L.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. I would have thought that Rabbi Silver would have talked about Yaakov's willingness to abandon Shimon. And I mean, this is a hostage story, and that seems to be the real evidence of favoritism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he didn't, but I will say in his defense, in his wonderful shiur on Yehuda and Tamar this past Shabbat between Mincha and Marav, every 5 minutes or so he stopped and said, I don't have anywhere near enough time. There's 100 things to say here. I need 3 hours. So I'm sure he had that in mind also. But
to supplement what Lance just said,
yeah,
there's also a beautiful parallelism here, because if you think about the way that we celebrate Yetziat Mitzrayim, where we actually reenact and re-embody the experience of Jews leaving Egypt, the brothers here are actually reenacting the sale of Yosef. And it's just a sweet literary parallelism in service of that upward arc.
Mm-hmm.
But it's
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm actually just quickly looking back to see. Yeah, I don't think that Rav Bazak really last week goes into this piece on the Yishmaelim and the Midianites, because I think that, again, that's an important piece for understanding, or for his approach in this one. But he really doesn't focus on that there, but he gives us his understanding here, just by the by, that it had to have been the brothers who took him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelim. It must have just been, when it mentions the Midianite traders who passed by, it was just somehow literally a passing by. James?
Sorry, couldn't find unmute. Can you explain upward arc? Aren't you just taking 2 points in a story, one that's higher than the last, and calling it an upward arc?
A question for Lance?
Well, it seemed like the other people knew what the upward arc meant as well. Maybe I missed that
No, no, no.
day or week
uh,
or month.
Yeah, I like your question, but I think that the upward arc has points, dozens of points, and they're turning points. For example, the Ish that helps Joseph find his brothers in Dothan. And there are many, many turning points like that. The angel that rescues Isaac. I mean, all these points throughout, without things can go the other way. I mean, very easily. And you have to have points that lead you from one point to the next point to the next point on an upward arc to get from one point to another. And I'm saying upward because I'm that I guess would be my interpretation. You could look at it as a linear plot as well.
Yeah, that's just storytelling, though, right?
What's that?
That's just storytelling. That every scene leads to the next scene.
Exactly. Well,
Yes.
I think that one of the problems that we have as contemporary readers of the Torah or just all these ancient texts is that we forget that there's an original audience. And what was it like for the original audience? I don't, there was no perhaps. One of my favorite words, I think appeared 5 times in this essay. And we put in the perhaps. But it's hard for me to imagine the original audience. And there is the historical and comparative method by E. Stoll, in which one of the main things that a literary scholar should do is to try to find the original audience. You can do that with Shakespeare, maybe, pretty much. But it's almost, how can you do it with Jeremiah, let alone Genesis? I mean, I mean, there are plenty of peoples before these texts. And, I was thinking about the wounding of Jacob in the thigh. And that is actually something that happens in other civilizations, stories from another civilization. So, you've got so many things rolling here. It's extremely complex. And I don't think that there's any way that anyone could say they have the absolute final answer. It's just one question after another.
Great. Yeah, yeah. And just to fill in, James, no, I don't think we had any other reference, or Rabbi Zak made a reference to an upward arc, but I think it is a narrative tool, and I think Lance sort of adding the upward dimension to the way he's seeing the progression of events here, but it's not necessarily radically different from other stories or approaches in the Torah.
But the arc of the story is just the storyline, basically.
I think so.
Okay, so that's
Well,
okay.
no, but there's also the concept of God. And one of the things that is pointed out about Joseph is that he's constantly referring to God as someone who is enabling him to interpret, enabling him to for example, I think he does say to his brothers that because you threw me into the pit, I'm going to help the Egyptians. I'm going to save a lot of lives, right? He says it directly.
Yes.
And so there's this vision that Joseph has of a benevolent, or let's put it this way, an accompanying God. Maybe he's a little bit of a sadistic sociopath, but nevertheless, there seems to be, from Joseph's point of view, a kind of happy ending.
David L., back to you.
Rev Stephen, do you want to speak for a couple of minutes on the concept of descent in service of ascent? Yirida l'tzorech aliyah.
Right. Yeah, someone quoted that to me in the Whitehall as they were coming to the lobby, and I wanted to go up, and they were going down to the basement, and I said, "I'll take a ride," and they said, "Yirida l'tzorech aliyah." Yes, I mean, I think thanks for the opportunity. What do I want to say about it? It certainly is um, a biblical narrative experience. I think the notion of Yetziat Mitzrayim or the slavery in Mitzrayim very much in Brit Ben Abitarim sort of sets up for us in the covenant between the parts the idea that there was somehow a necessary, even though it's not explained why it's necessary, but there is this necessary going down to Egypt in order to return to the land. Even in last week's Parsha in Vayesha, Vayered Yehuda me'et Achav, doesn't just say, and of course Rabbi Silver pointed this out as well, doesn't just say that he parted or he went, but there's a going down, and that somehow in the experience he learns something, he develops in some way that enables him to come back stronger, better. So I think it's sometimes it might be possible to have argued for like just veering for the sake of returning, but I do think in the Torah we do have that idea of there's something that's built in, where there are these descents which are a necessary part of development to then return stronger or better. What are your thoughts on it?
I just thought really again as a coda to what Lance was suggesting, there's a school of biblical interpretation that suggests, and it's a mystical school, and it suggests that there are sparks of holiness that are outside of the land, and particularly in places of poor behavior like Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
That people, the Bnei Israel, are sent there to capture these sparks of holiness. They go down Yirida l'tzorech in order to raise up these elements back towards the source.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a similar image of as upward ascent, but the Kabbalists had a descent in the service of the ascent.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, to bracha as we wrap up.
Yeah, I'm just seeing another possible mirror image in the stories of the Torah that relates to going down in order to go up. I'm thinking of the image of the well and how important a center that was for people all over. And the only way to get water from the well is to send a bucket down, so that you have to actually bend down in order to cause the water to come up. So it's like there's this constant image reminding us of Yirida l'tzorech aliyah.
Mm-hmm. Nice. It reminds me
Water
of
being such a life-giving force.
yeah. There's I feel there it tickles my brain about some kind of midrash about that has to do with Yehuda and Yosef and a well, but I can't draw it up at this time. It's descended and can't seem to ascend at the moment. If it comes to me, I'll share it. Okay, Lance, you got the last word.
Final thought here. In the movie Grease, if you remember, the car goes up in the air, and at the original Willy Wonka, they blast through the sky, and these are tremendous upward arcs. And I think you'll find a lot of other movies that end that way with a real blast for an upward arc.
Great. All right, great directionality to think about here, and 3 comments from the Parsha. I always remind us or sometimes remind us, the these comments of Rav Bazak, that as the book is called, Nekudot Pticha, starting points. So they sometimes leave us with more questions than answers, but they, open our eyes to different little dimensions of the Parsha, and hopefully we take them in different directions as we continue to journey through the week. So thanks to all, love to mom and dad, and good rest of the week to all. We will be on again next Monday night. Looking forward to it. Chanukah Sameach. Good night.